Clemson's dream season is over, and now Brad Brownell faces a major challenge with rebuilding a roster that's losing a ton of stars. That's all coming up right now on Locked on Clemson.
You are Locked on Clemson, your daily podcast on the Clemson Tigers. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Tiger fans? Morgan Thomas here, Clemson fan, Clemson grad, host and producer of this show, and part-time host and producer over on 105.5 FM, The Roar. You've probably listened to me a couple of times this week, and thank you so much for tuning in to the radio. And also thank you so much for making Locked on Clemson your first listen every day. We're part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. And if you're new to the show, be sure to hit that like and subscribe and notification bell so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to follow me over on X in between episodes at the Morgan T Show. Today's show is brought to you by 5 Hour Energy. Head over to 5hourenergy.com to find over 15 flavors to choose from. Need one now? Grab a 5 Hour Energy shot at your local grocery or convenience store. Stock up today and stay energized. Coming up on today's show, we're going to talk about Clemson's rebuild and how they're going to fix these roster problems that we're looking at after this tournament loss. I know a lot of people still want to dwell on the loss, but we've got to think about what's the future for Clemson basketball as well. Brad Brownell's job just got a whole lot tougher because he's got a lot of things that he's going to have to replace, a lot of key areas on his basketball team. And then finally, football is king, and Clelin Ferrell came out and recently reminded us what is the number one sport at Clemson. I'll give you my thoughts on that as well. So Clemson and Brad Brownell have to rebuild after this massive tournament collapse. We know how it went down. We've talked about it already. I told you this week that this could happen. I warned you about disaster possibly being in the future for Clemson. Unfortunately, it was worse than I ever would have imagined. They allowed McNeese State to get hot. They were bad with turnovers. They got destroyed in the rebounding game, which was an absolute shock. It almost felt like Clemson was playing against Dennis Rodman and Charles Barkley. And a couple times in the game, they couldn't hit anything. They couldn't hit the broadside of the barn. They couldn't hit the ocean if they jumped in. It was just a terrible, terrible night for Clemson. And I say all that to say that was really just the first half. You know, they scored 13 points in the first half, a horrible beginning of the game. But then when you look at it, they did actually score like 40 points in 10 minutes in the second half, which was unheard of and crazy to think that that's what they did to claw themselves back into it. And if you look at just the box score, you think, man, this team, this was a close game. McNeese State must have just squeaked by at the very end. Nope, it wasn't just a two-score close loss for Clemson. It was an embarrassing disaster for sure. And Clemson and Brad Brownell must rebuild after this collapse. It wasn't just a loss, though. It's a tough loss right now, but it is a turning point for this basketball team. And that's one thing that I'm kind of a little bit nervous about when it comes to Brad Brownell getting a 6-year contract extension, because what do you bring back that you have right now? This team is going to look completely different next season than what you have right now, and that could be an amazingly good thing. But that also could set Clemson up for a disaster as well because of all the pieces that they're going to have to replace. So this was supposed to be the team, though. Clemson was a 5 seed. A lot of people felt like Clemson was underseeded, including myself. They set a school record for wins in 27, ACC wins in 18. They had they finished with a lot of really good wins at the end of the season in the ACC, not something that you're usually used to seeing from a Clemson basketball team. And they made it to the NCAA tournament 2 years in a row, which, only Oliver Purnell was able to do it 3 years in a row. So Brad Brownell now has an opportunity to kind of get that monkey off his back, and being compared to Oliver Purnell so much. And you know what everybody likes to say? He's the winningest coach in Clemson basketball history, but he is also the losingest coach in Clemson basketball history as long as he's been with the program. This team was supposed to be the team, though, after what we saw, how they started out so good at the beginning of the season. They took down Kentucky. They took down Duke throughout the season. They just wiped the floor with all the other ACC teams. This team had the experience. They had the leadership. At least initially, we thought they had the depth. And they had momentum until they flamed out in the NCAA tournament, absolutely imploding until they fought back to try to make something of nothing there. But we will kind of walk away from this team as a team that was just a good team. A lot of people will argue with me, Morgan, they were a great team. I would say that, they fizzled out at the wrong time. They peaked too early and they started to fall off at the end. And we saw a disaster in that Louisville game, and then following it up against McNeese State was not a good look for Brad Brownell, was not a good look for these seniors and graduate students that are no longer going to be able to play anymore for the team. They're not going to get any more chances with Clemson. Now, Clemson is losing. The big problem that I think we have is that they are losing their core set of players. You're not going to get Ian Schieffelin anymore. He's already, gone through 4 years. This was his senior campaign. So Ian Schieffelin, your rebounding machine, how are you going to replace that? How are you going to replace a leader like that in the low post, right? Chase Hunter is no longer going to be on the team. How are you going to replace a leader at the point guard position, a guy who willed the team's way back into games and kind of took the team on his shoulders? That's going to be extremely difficult to get back. The rebounding and the confidence down low in Schieffelin, extremely difficult. Chase Hunter and the leadership there and the skills and ability to drain shots when you needed them the most. Not all the time. I get it. He wasn't perfect, but he was very good for this last season that we had him. So you're going to have to replace those two guys. I don't think you have anybody on the roster right now that can realistically replace either one of those guys. Dylan Hunter is not it. Dale Jones right now is not it. Chase Hunter really wasn't it until, his very final season. Ian Schieffelin, I don't see anybody that would be it and could be a rebound machine for you right now on this roster. Victor Locken is going to be gone. Who do you have that can replace him? I mean, you've got Reeves, but is he really going to be a guy that can replace him? I mean, right now he seems to be a very disappointing player for the Tigers and kind of a miss in the transfer portal. Miles Foster as well, kind of a guy that looked really good that first 2 weeks of basketball that he played with Clemson and then fizzled out very quickly and was exposed for his lack of athleticism. Clemson already struggled with athleticism. And that's what I said on the radio today was, it just seemed like they were physically, just dominated by the other team, by Louisville and by McNeese State. And it just seemed like the other team had better athletes than Clemson for whatever reason. And I was not expecting that going in. I think Clemson had better talent, but as far as just athletes that maybe not the best basketball players, but just good athletes all around, kind of shook Clemson. Memphis had the same thing, shook Clemson in that way. And we know Louisville did it twice against Clemson, and then now McNeese State. So I feel like there's something there. I would love to see Brad Brownell go into the transfer portal and get more athletic guys than what we had this season. It was a great group of guys, don't get me wrong, but you've got a lot of guys to replace now and not a lot of answers about how those players, how you're going to get those players and when are you going to get them. And then finally, Chauncey Wiggins came out and said that he has no comment on, if he's going to return to the team or hit the transfer portal. Now, I know a lot of fans out there have a different opinion about that, but you're talking 5 out of 6 players that were in the regular rotation, possibly out, maybe all 6 in the regular rotation of the 6. So you're going to be replacing a lot of players with only Dylan Hunter as a true, week in, week out kind of rotational starter coming back. You could possibly say Dale Jones was part of that, but the one thing that you can say is that might be on the bright side is that Jaden Zachary had 1 year of JUCO And, with the Pavia situation where they're allowing him to come back and JUCO years don't count, which I think is a good thing. I think junior college years not counting makes a whole lot of sense to me. So maybe they go through that appeal process, and Jaden Zachary has already said he would come back to Clemson. So you could be in a better spot than having to replace 5 players or 6 players in a rotation, and maybe only having to replace 4 or 3 in a rotation. But you've got to get more depth. You've got to replace what you've lost, and specifically like rebounding, leadership, shooting, and size in general. And it's going to be a tall task for Brad Brownell for sure. There is a very small margin for failure here because he's now got a contract extension. He's now been here for, 15, 16 years with the team. And this season was a step forward. And as long as he can continue to do things, and I think he's very good in the portal, but as long as Brownell can do things to keep this team incrementally in the mix for an NCAA tournament, if they start falling out of this in the mix for an NCAA tournament, that's where it's going to be a little bit hard to handle as a Clemson fan. And I think eventually hard to handle as the university staff looks at this team. Now, right now, all signs are pointing towards Brownell may be able to go back in the transfer portal and replenish this, but it's hard to say if that will be truly the case. We're hoping that Brad Brownell can go back into the transfer portal and work his magic. Next up, we're going to talk about Clemson's disaster and how it cost them the season, and if it really is changed the whole narrative of this season after such a great start. We're all about stats because numbers don't lie, and when it comes to the all-new Nissan Armada Pro-4X, the numbers are at an MVP level. With the ability to tow up to 8,500 pounds, it can quite literally carry the whole team plus the gear wherever you need to go. It's powered by a twin-turbo V6 engine, delivering the strength and performance to handle highways, back roads, and everything in between. And with room for up to 8 people, the Armada Pro-4X is built for big crews, big adventures, and even bigger memories. Whether you're exploring off-road trails or rolling up at the arena, the Armada Pro-4X brings power, versatility, and style wherever you go. Take your adventures to new heights in the all-new Nissan Armada Pro-4X. Learn more at nissanusa.com. And this episode is also brought to you by 5 Hour Energy. Daylight savings time snuck up on us again, and you are feeling that lost hour of sleep. I know, and I am as well. 5 Hour Energy has your back. The extra sunshine means more time for fun, and sometimes it means a little bit of a boost needed to power through the day. Whether you're staying up late watching the NCAA tournament or squeezing in a round of golf after work or just trying to keep up with your busy day, 5 Hour Energy gives you that quick, refreshing pick-me-up wherever and whenever you need it. I've been staying up late watching all the tournament action, and 5 Hour Energy can help me keep up the next day for sure. Head over to 5hourenergy.com to find over 15 flavors to choose from, including watermelon, blue raspberry, and peach mango. You can even build your own 12-pack or 24-pack delivered right to your door. Need one now? Grab a 5 Hour Energy shot at your local grocery or convenience store. They're everywhere. Stock up today and stay energized. Clemson's first half disaster versus McNeese State cost them the season, ended their season prematurely, really, and also kind of changed the entire narrative on the season because of how bad they were. It was a historically bad first half, as you remember. They lost the game within the first few minutes of the game, in my opinion. They scored just 13 points. Fewest ever in an NCAA tournament game, and it was just really bad within the shot clock era, if you will. They shot 5 for 24 from the field and 1 for 15 from 3. And they turned the ball over 10 times. McNeese State dominated the paint 26-8. It wasn't just a slow start, it was a complete meltdown. And it begs the question to me, who is at fault? And this is what we talked about on the radio today. Who really should be to blame? And, To be honest with you, a lot of people said, well, this team really wasn't ready. They played soft. I said they played like a marshmallow in a parking lot, just melted and soft and squishy. We thought we were going to get the Clemson Tigers, but we got a Tiger Pinata and got beat up in that game. And I still agree with that. I think that it was an absolute embarrassment, and I never want to watch that game again. And I hope you don't either. However, who do you really blame in this scenario? Can you blame the fact that Dylan Hunter was not on the team at this time because he was injured? No, you really can't blame that. And I feel like it's kind of shocking that we really put everything on Dylan Hunter, considering the fact that he wasn't a starter for most of the season, and the fact that nobody would have ever thought this season that it would come down to us saying the fact that we didn't have Dylan Hunter was the reason you'd lose a tournament game, at least the initial tournament game. Maybe when you got to a more difficult opponent, but the very first tournament game where you're a huge favorite, and not only seeding wise, but also in point spread from Vegas, it was, to me, unacceptable by this Clemson basketball team. And I don't blame Dylan Hunter. I don't think Dylan Hunter was the main reason why they couldn't get this win, but I do think it was an important factor among other factors. And we talked about the biggest factor for sure being how bad they were in a slump going into this game, and the previous, couple of games, how they had been going through 6 and 7 minutes of scoring droughts. No one would have really thought they would have gone through 2 5-minute droughts in one half for a 10-minute total drought in the first half of this game, or the previous game against McNeese State. But do you blame Brad Brownell, or do you blame the players, or who do you hold accountable more? Well, instead of pointing the finger here and saying blame, I would say that the biggest place of accountability needs to fall on the players. I mean, to me, I think the coach has a lot to do with stopping momentum, and maybe Brad Brownell could have done better with not holding on to all those timeouts. And, he has that problem. He has that problem for years of allowing teams to go on runs, not calling timeouts, having players that he knows he needs to sub in and refusing to burn a timeout to sub them in, and just letting other teams get a lead on him because he just doesn't want to burn a timeout when he knows he doesn't have the right personnel on the court. He's done that many times. I know you can think back to it. How many times the player that you really want on the court is not on the court, but they're at the scorer's table waiting to get in the game, but Brad Brownell won't call a timeout. And it makes sense that this happened again, but was it the reason for the historically bad first half? No, I don't think so. They shot 5 of 24 and 1 for 15 from 3. And a lot of those 3 points were not trash 3-pointers. They were just absolutely horrible shots that they were throwing up bricks. And everybody said, well, Morgan, they're going to work out of it. And even I kind of had gotten to the point where I convinced myself that they were going to use McNeese State to work their way out of this shooting slump. And it didn't work. Well, maybe it worked, but it worked too little too late. And the very beginning of the game, or at least the first half of the game, was an absolute disaster. A team that can't shoot threes and is 1 for 15, a team that turns the ball over, and also that is oversized, that outmatches them as far as size goes, but cannot get any points in the paint, gets absolutely trashed in the paint, to me is not a coach's fault. You could have them, you could say that they could have adjusted some of their, play calling with the zone man rotation that McNeese State did. I could say that they got outcoached in that sense. I could say they got outcoached in the timeout situation and maybe the player management or the time clock management. I think that, there is definitely blame on the head coach for sure, but this team won 27 games. This team won 18 ACC games. Why do you have to get them motivated to play an NCAA tournament game where it could be possibly your last game of your college career? There's no need for that. I don't think that I blame Brad Brownell at all for that. I don't think Brad Brownell was out there shooting 15 of those 3-pointers and missing 14 of them. I don't think Brad Brownell was making terrible passes here. And it wasn't just this game. It was the past couple of games where the passes were just atrocious and ridiculous. So my first place of emphasis really goes on the players. They had everything they needed and set up for them. This was actually a really good bracket for them. I thought that they could go through McNeese State and beat them in grit and size. I thought that they could go to Purdue, not the Purdue with Zach Edey, but the Purdue that they have now. And I thought they could match up really well with them and get to get to the Sweet 16 against Houston. So I did believe that. And everything kind of went crashing down very quickly and just kind of it was a huge head scratcher. But it's kind of makes you flip-flop where you're like, it was a horrible first 30 minutes of the game. And then the last 20 minutes was like the greatest team ever decided to show up. It just was too little, too late. The team had the talent. The team had enough players on the team. They had enough depth. But the unfortunate thing is the depth didn't show up. I mean, you saw it against Louisville. Brad tried to go with Heidebreeder, but he couldn't do anything. He tried to go with Reeves. He's not going to do anything for you. He tried to go with Wiggins and Del Jones. Those guys didn't do anything for you either. Nothing he could throw out there or rotate worked at all. Now, Brad Brownell admitted after the game, he said, quote, "I didn't do a very good job with my guys. We weren't really prepared for the zone to man." Now, that was a little bit shocking, I think, but it makes sense when you look back. Hindsight's 2020, right? You look back and you say, well, what kind of defense would you match up against a team who's been in a bad slump right now shooting the basketball? They don't have anybody that really scares you at all. Well, playing a tight 2-3 zone and keeping them out of the paint and pushing them to the perimeter actually worked out really well for Clemson. Or for McNeese State. Clemson got a bunch of open shots and took it like candy from a baby. However, it wasn't because they couldn't make any of those shots. I would want the team to continue taking those shots. Unfortunately, though, they didn't make them. Now, the one thing that I will say is I don't know if he necessarily needed to get his guys prepared for the game, but when it comes to prepared for zone to man, that's where those timeouts come into play to me. And I don't think it's egregious to say, oh, you got to get rid of Brad Brownell and all this thing. I think Brad Brownell is the best coach that Clemson could have for right now until he proves us otherwise. And I don't think that you take away from what he's been able to accomplish with this team the past 2 seasons. I think you have to go by record. That's what you want to be evaluated on. You don't want to be evaluated on years of service, really, or frustration from the past leaking into this season. He made it to the NCAA tournament 2 years in a row. He had the most wins in Clemson history, and he had the most ACC wins in the Clemson history. And he had many opportunities. He was very close to winning the regular season ACC, only having one loss. I mean, the only team that he was behind had one loss in the ACC, and they had 2. So I think that overall, the season, from a coaching standpoint, evaluation, if I'm the general manager, if I'm the athletic director, I give Brad Brownell a passing grade and I say he's satisfactory and we move on to the next season. However, I'm a little bit nervous about the 6 years because he is going to have to make a huge rebuild here going into next season. But I don't blame him completely on this game. I think these guys have to stand up. As Eric Bakich says, the parents shine at home, the coach shines at practice, and the players shine at the games. And there was no shine from most of these players throughout the game, and not just this game, but the past couple of games, especially when it comes to that 6th man, that 7th man in rotation, just absolutely non-existent. Not only were they non-existent, but the bench players for Clemson didn't even seem like they really even wanted the ball. And going back to kind of like, how do you replace what you're losing in 2025? How do you replace them in the winter of 2025 at the end of this year? I think with the transfer portal opening up for basketball very soon, I think that you do a full revamp. I mean, if you keep anybody from the bench, you keep the guys that you recruited and you think that are going to be successful for you and that you can develop. But these guys that you brought in as transfers already, and they seem to fizzle out or show nothing. I don't see why you keep them around, to be honest with you. I know that sounds weird coming from college basketball or college type sport, but these guys are getting paid and they're getting paid a lot of money. So, why would you keep around underperformers or people who were absolute busts from the transfer portal player market? Chase Hunter, Heroics at the end, Jaden Zachary's heroics at the end, unfortunately not enough for Clemson to make it through. The Tigers did make 18 out of 15 three-pointers after halftime and cut the deficit down to 2, but it was too little, too late. And I think really, again, it goes back to the players. Just they're gonna walk away from this game, and a lot of the fans are gonna say, well, they were just an okay team or a good team that beat up on a bad ACC conference. And there's a lot of truth to that. I think that this team was a good team that had a bad day. I think they peaked at the wrong time. They peaked about a month too early, and they started to fizzle out, not only from a fatigue standpoint, but from an injury standpoint, and then from a shooting standpoint, they started to fizzle out. You would have rather them have gotten hot at the beginning of the ACC tournament and not, a month prior to that. But they got hot when they got hot, and they finished the season strong. Overall, it was a successful season. You have to rate the coach based off of where they ended up, NCAA tournament. That's a win for me. I know a lot of people said, well, we wanted them to go much further than that. Well, that is true. You did want them to go much further than that. So did I. And I think they had that expectation as well. But that's not a fireable offense for not making it as far as you wanted to make it. I think that going to the NCAA tournament is definitely a huge goal for this team to consistently do that. They need to be in the NCAA tournament more years than they're not. Remember, just when we were younger, remember it was Clemson would get bounced out of the NIT tournament. Clemson would not even make the NIT. Well, now they've kind of worked their way out of that. They've built something better than that. So can they keep this consistency in the NCAA tournament? Because you will get another year where you're going to have a run. You're also going to get another year where you're going to be one and done. Even the biggest of big, the blue bloods of blue bloods, all blue bloods do this. Virginia has had this type of game happen where it was absolute disaster in a tournament. That's why these games are one and done, because these games, that's what happens in these games. And so you can't really predict what's going to happen in the tournament. That's why the odds of having a perfect bracket are almost nothing. I mean, like so high, so low of an odds that you're not going to get it. It's not easy to predict. It's not easy to do. And so I don't really blame or have much frustration on the fact that they lost this game. It was a little bit bitter about how they lost, or at the very beginning, but they clawed their way back. So I'm okay with how they continued to fight. And that shows that they were mentally tough. They were gritty. They listened to their coach. They didn't give up. They were just a good team that just had a bad night, in my opinion. Being able to cut down a deficit that much at the end of the game was great. Too little, too late. A team that had what felt like Final Four potential fizzled out in the end. So unfortunately, just not enough to get on to the next level. So we'll have to see, what does Brad Brownell do from here? He's going to have a lot of players to replace, and I'm curious what's going to happen next season. But as this season, we put a bow on this season, I think we walk away. Unfortunately, the narrative is a good team that was in a bad ACC league and just fizzled out at the wrong time. And I think that's an honest assessment of the 2024-2025 Clemson basketball team. These guys are going to come back and be honored many years from now as graduates, as guys that from this year, from this era. And they're probably going to have a lot of, maybe some sleepless nights right now, maybe some frustration because of what they were not able to accomplish at the very end. And unfortunately, that's how it goes. A lot of times March Madness and March is what it's all about. And one of the callers mentioned on the radio, would you rather have a mediocre team during the season, but one that goes on a run? No, I wouldn't mind having a team that competes in the ACC title and their ACC regular title every single year. I know that's not super realistic to do it every single year because of the competition you have and because of some of the expansion talks we've had rumored around. But I will say that if Clemson can, more years than not, in a handful of years, in 5 years, if they can 3 to 4 times go to the NCAA tournament, I would be satisfied with that, because I don't think, Clemson is ever going to be the true blue blood, consistent Elite Eight, Final Four type team in basketball. My opinion would be once every 5 years you get a run that goes deep, maybe Elite Eight, Final Four, and then the other couple of years you at least get in. So that would be my overall goal for stability for this program, and I do think Brad Brownell can do that. All right, we're going to wrap up the show talking about the other sport at Clemson, the one that is probably the most important and why it's the most important, according to Clelin Ferrell.
The NCAA tournament is here, and so is the bracket breakdown.
Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup.
Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free.
It's your team every day.
Clelin Ferrell gave it to us. He gave us honesty. And while he just recently re-signed with the Washington Commanders, he was asked about Clemson getting beat bad by McNeese State. And his response was, quote, "Well, we're a football school, 3-time national championship Clemson Tigers, NCAA football. We're a football school." And to be honest with you, he's not wrong, and he knows it. He's one of the best players that Clemson has had on the defensive line. He helped Dabo Swinney set the standard on defense and in the national stage. And while Clemson is definitely a basketball school, or the basketball school the basketball team should be respected for Clemson. He says what a lot of fans probably already know and think as well. At the end of the day, Clemson's number one sport is football. And I would agree with that. You know, when I do a video and I talk about Clemson football, it's going to probably get more views, more length of time watched, more clicks, you know, and more shares, right? And I'm going to get more subscribers from those football videos. Even if it's potential players that Clemson could get or just speculation on football, it gets a lot of views and a lot of traction. So I could just do a bunch of football videos and do nothing else. But I know that's not what my core fans want to listen to. That's not what Locked On fans only want to hear about. Locked On fans, I think, really care about Clemson as a whole, not just football, but basketball, baseball, softball, and any of the other sports as well. So I try to have a variety, but I can understand where he's coming from because football is definitely king at Clemson. You know, if I do a basketball video, it may get a couple hundred views. But if you do a football video, the odds are it's going to get up to 1,000 or more. And you're just going to, that's just the way it is. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but that's the way the Clemson fan base is. I don't think that's the case for the diehard fans. As I mentioned, I do think that most of the casual fans, maybe the once a week podcast listeners or the every other day podcast listeners, maybe are more of just, hey, give me the football updates and let's go from there. But Clemson is definitely a football school. But the thing is, I kind of mentioned this to Mickey Plyler. It doesn't have to be just a mediocre basketball school. I think you can have both. And there's definitely teams out there that do have both, like Alabama, for example. I mean, Alabama, while they were a Nick Saban powerhouse, started to build their basketball program. And I don't think that you have to be stuck one way or another. Now, there is a balance there because if you go too far on one, then you start to lose your identity on football, and you don't want that unless you're maybe North Carolina or Duke or Kentucky, Kansas, maybe one of those teams. I think that Clemson needs to, and Graham Neff needs to be very careful with the amount of money allocated to each program. And I don't want to take away from basketball so much that they can't be competitive anymore. I think Brad Brownell needs to continue to be competitive in the transfer portal because for whatever reason, he's just not as good in traditional recruiting. And whether it's he just doesn't want to be involved in traditional high school recruiting or AAU recruiting or whatever it may be, he seems to be much more comfortable, much more willing and accepting of the transfer portal and that player market. And he does really well with it. So I think that, you know, he needs to have the resources to continue to compete there. He obviously has a couple of years of success here, so he can continue to build on that and show that Clemson is not quite there yet. But he needs a steady flow of income, whether it be revenue sharing or donor, donor donations, I guess. But you've got to have some sort of revenue stream there for Brad Brownell to use, because if it runs out, to me, then he won't be able to compete in the transfer portal, and then you'll start to go through more years where you're struggling to be relevant and not stay within my 5-year cycle that I would like to see. While the line might hurt right now because, Clemson had a lot of high hopes in basketball. I mean, they had the Elite Eight last year. They were a 5 seed, underseeded, many thought. But nationally, Clemson is more feared in football than they are feared in basketball. And they're still just not there yet. And they need to continue to kind of find ways or figure out ways to win some really, really big, shocking postseason basketball. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the caller saying, would you rather have a mediocre team that peaks in March? And maybe you just need that once. Maybe that's what happened last season, is it was an okay team that peaked at the right time. And this team was a good team, an even better team than the last season, but didn't peak at the right time. If it were me and I was Graham Neff and I was the general manager of Clemson Athletics, I would say something like, Brad, every 5 years, I'm going to give you the largest purse or double the money that I normally give you. And this is going to be your year. And you need to go out and get the best of the best, the cream of the crop from the transfer portal. And the rest, I'll give you your average. But that once every 5 years, I'm giving you this huge purse to go out and make an absolute run for it. I'm not saying you have to be the Yankees or the Dodgers, but I'm saying I'd like to see 1 year where you just pay all the money to get 5 of the best players possible. And then that can get you by. At least me as a basketball fan, that can get me by, and get me on through a couple of just average years. If I had 1 year where you had a run with a lot of really good talent that maybe even gets drafted, then that would give me a little bit of a lull time for the couple of years to then go use it mostly on football. So I think it is still a huge challenge on how Clemson is going to compete, but they've shown that they have a coach who is willing to adjust and do things to kind of try to get this team built the best way possible. There could be some tough years ahead, but there also could be some runs as well. That's just kind of how basketball goes. Hey, thank you so much for being a part of the show tonight. That's it for me at the Morgan T Show over on X. Make sure you follow me there. And thanks for making Locked On Clemson your first listen of the day. For your second listen, check out Locked On College Basketball with Isaac Shade and Andy Patton. March is here, and be the most informed college basketball fan throughout the madness. Find Locked On College Basketball on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And as always, Tiger fans, that's the end of the week. I thank you so much for supporting the show. I hope you have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Monday, and I'll see you at the top of the hill.